Hey, everybody. Welcome back. This is now episode 5 of our unauthorized Final Cut Pro 10. And today we are going to, you can count. Yeah. You can, today we are doing sharing and delivery. So how do you interface with other editors? How do you interface with other departments? There's a few great tools that come along from third parties to facilitate some of this, because not everybody needs to share with the sound department or a visual effects house or whatever. So that said, let's get into it.
Share. We'll share about sharing.
Yeah, we'll share about sharing. So let's take it like chronologically through production. So you're working with your team, and you need to pass some stuff from editor A to editor B, or from person 1 to person 2. Could be anybody.
Or from DIT on location, syncing footage to the editor in their bay.
Depending on how the DIT is working. Yes, let's talk about from Final Cut to Final Cut aspect of it. Because one thing that is a complaint and a hindrance about Final Cut 10 is that there's no collaboration a la Avid, where everybody can be working from the same library, the same core project together, and just opening different parts of it. Premiere has a version of sharing, which I'm not sold on. I find it to be
once, and it may have improved, but it caused a lot of technical issues.
I hope it's improved, because I wasn't a fan of that. And I know Resolve has something, and I can honestly say I have not attempted to use it at all. But I've used Avid extensively, and I do think it has that corner of the market pretty securely locked down right now.
We're not going to lie. It's a bare bones approach, but Avid has gotten it right. Final Cut doesn't really offer it, but there's workarounds. There's ways to share information. It's not as seamless as Avid. We think it's worth the extra steps because everything else is so much smoother in many ways. So this is one place where you're going to have to jump through a couple of hoops that are very small hoops. They're not on fire. It's not a circus hoop. It's a small
Would it be easier if they were bigger hoops, just because it'd be easier to get through them?
That's true. I didn't think of that.
All right. Well, so first of all, let's just talk about the idea of the Final Cut library. So the Final Cut library it's an isolated environment. If you, depending on your settings, you can keep everything you need in one package inside the library. You can keep all your media. You can keep all your titles. You can keep all your effects. You can keep everything that you need in one place. So that makes it extremely portable. Say somebody wants to walk away for a weekend and go work remotely like everybody's doing today. It'd be very easy to press a couple buttons, collect all the bits you need, even if you've been storing them outside of your library, and then walk away and come back and be perfectly fine. Final Cut's intended to work that way. It's not intended to work in large groups. That said, I have worked in large groups with Final Cut. One of the first movies, actually I think the first major motion picture to use Final Cut at a studio level. And anyway, there's ways to do it. It's not as easy as some other systems, but there's ways to do it. So let's go through the first basic step of something. So as we talked about before, and let's just look at this library. I'm going to highlight this file this event right here. So this is a event of dailies that came in. So it's got some raw footage, it's got some sound, it's got the sync clips that were made from that stuff. Now, if I was an assistant editor on something, I would just save that for myself and stow it away. From that, I would refine that down for an editor. And that's what this stuff is. You know what? For now, I'm going to just lose the timeline so we can see more of this. So this scene 90 here, that is the dailies for scene 90. And this scene 119 is the dailies for scene 119. Just a oneer. And then, scene 120. Okay, so you want to share between editors or assistant to editor or whatever the situation is, or any kind of round tripping. So a couple things to look out for. And Premiere users are probably familiar with this as well. So we're going to make what's called a transfer library. And I have that up here at the top of my Final Cut window. You can have more than one library open at a time, more than one project open at a time. When I make this brand new transfer library, and today is March 27th, it always makes an event with that, but there's nothing else in it. So
I'm sorry.
Let's say, what's that? May?
It's May 27th.
It's okay. Whatever day it is. It's 5/27, Mike.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't help myself.
Thank you. Yeah, he's in the OCD. May, March, whatever. June, January, June. So this is an empty library. And if I were to take this event and move it over there, something undesirable would happen. And let me explain why. These are synced clips, meaning they came from these dailies. So a bunch of audio and picture that were married and now are playing together in sync. You can see this little icon here representing a sync clip. If I move this event with all those sync clips in it, what's going to happen in the transfer library? And I'm going to say no to copying the media, because it will be faster. If I now look at that event, you're going to see the sync clips, which are here, and all of the other clips that were used to make the sync clips here. Clearly, you don't want to work that way. Final Cut is just protecting the integrity of the sync clips by including the elements that made them. Perfectly logical, bit of business and understandable, but not desirable for editing. So I'm just going to undo. And what is common in a transfer library is to first have it contain all your raw elements. And so this would be something an assistant would maintain every day. And so if I move the raw elements into the transfer library first, and then decide to move my scene 90 here, which only has the sync clips, I'm just going to drag and drop. Now the scene 90 comes through as intended and can be used without any further manipulation or business.
Doesn't need to protect with raw data because the elements are already in there. So it's smart enough to point to the new elements.
Correct. Which is why when you're working on a crew where this passing back and forth is happening, the order that you do things in is important. So if I'm moving something to another editor or an assistant editor or whatever, I'm going to first move the elements, and then I'll move the specific stuff that's been changed by it. Now, there's something in Premiere where this sort of endless clips pop up too in shared projects. I don't know if anyone has had experience with it, but I have, and it's a similar sort of inconvenience. You just got to know how to deal with it. And I always recommend that people move things inside of events. It is possible to move let's say just move this rough cut. We've got our May 27th bin here, and I'm going to call this cuts from Mike, which is confusing because we're both named Mike.
Who knows?
And I'm going to grab that cut and I'm going to pull it over here. And again, say no to the media. And so this is interesting. So you see the cut here, and you also see the clips, which were not yet in this library, which are all these sound effects and songs and stuff that are in the cut. You can do a couple things with that. You could just command delete them and they'll go away. They're just being hidden. And should you ever need to recall them and click on one of these sound effects and do Shift F, which is match clip, it's going to go to it. And they're still in there. They're just hiding. Mm-hmm. So there's a few things here that you need to be aware of. And there's a few things that you need to kind of work around. That said, you saw how quick it was to move something from one place to another. The larger project gets, larger library gets, there is time involved in opening the libraries, depending on how big they are, depending on how many render files, stuff like that. You know, this is common across the board.
You have how complicated sequences are, how long they are.
Right. So let's just quickly modify this edit. I'm just going to put a 2 after it. Let's add a sound effect. I'm going to go to the sound effects library, take the strange machine sound effect and just connect it right there. So if I want to move this back, like I'm now an assistant editor, I spent all day finessing the effects on this cut. And so if I now move this cuts from Mike back across, what's going to happen is, cuts from Mike, it's going to reveal that strange machine sound effect because that was absent in the other library. Mm-hmm. So this is Final Cut making an effort to be sure that everything that you've got in a cut is going to be in your library. Sometimes you have to sort of reorganize, and I guess in the instance of Avid, you probably wouldn't see that in a bin unless you did, what is it called when you just show all reference clips?
Right.
So it's that kind of thing. But again, I'm just going to clear, I'm just going to clear that out of there with a command delete. And that's essentially how you move things back and forth between editors, no matter what it is. If it's dailies, if it's raw footage, if it's a cut.
So now that's you're showing this on OneDrive with the information shared. A project I worked on, we had the DIT. What's DIT? Digital interface or digital something technician. She was taking all the footage on set from the camera cars, all the audio, making dailies, adding all the metadata from the script sync, putting it on a shuttle drive with the new footage. I'd get the shuttle drive loaded into my system. Very similar process. I had to copy the media over first, but this works shared storage, or if you're transferring over from another drive.
Right. There's a couple other utilities which I'm just going to mention that do this kind of thing. One of them is called Command Post, and it has shared. The website is commandpost.io, and it has a shared clipboard. So Mike and I, who are in different locations, could share a clipboard. I could come down here and say copy, and then it would show up in the clipboard, and Mike could retrieve that and paste it into his timeline. That's one way to do it. There's another thing called Post Lab, which is it's an online cloud library management tool that works very well. It's still a little complicated, but it works really well.
But it's a solid product.
Yeah, I worked with Arctic Whiteness to develop this thing called Final Cut Library Opener, which allowed me just to go open up Mike's library behind the scenes. And since Final Cut saves all the time, it's always saving. You don't have to save. Everything's always current up to the last moment. So I like that tool quite a lot, and I can recommend it.
We haven't even mentioned that, and that's kind of cool. You never hit the save button in Final Cut. Anything you do, you crash right then. Maybe you lost that last step, but everything you do is saved instantly.
Right, right, which is awesome. Cool. Yeah, it's really great. That's kind of the way to do it. I mean, it's not rocket science. You got to keep everything organized just like any other system, and you're just moving elements inside of events. I recommend between libraries, and it's kind of as simple as that.
And you'd like an assistant who knows what they're doing, who really has it down and is doing it properly. But you want that in Avid. You want that in any system you're working on. You have the right assistant. Sharing between editors, between people, is one or two steps more than it would be on Avid. But it's not hard. It's not a lot. And it is not that much extra. The time savings you get elsewhere for us are worth dealing with that minor step. Right.
So let's move on to sound. Everybody who works on everybody who works on everybody who works on a major any kind of network or movie, whatever, they are delivering to sound department. So how do we do that? There's a couple things to do here. So first of all, everyone delivers guide tracks all the time, so they know what you're hearing in the editing room. So the tool, that part of Final Cut is awesome, and I'm going to show it to you now. So we have this beautiful fine finished cut here, and I'm going to wait. Let's go back to my other one without the strange machine effects in it. And okay, so this is perfect. Spent all day doing it, and I'm going to do my reference my reference tracks for everybody, my guide tracks. So I'm going to go to Share menu in the upper corner and choose Master File Default, and I'm just going to kind of go through the steps on this because I do think it's awesome. You get to choose a format, picture and sound, and normally that's where you'd stop with other stuff. Say, okay, here's picture and sound, and then you'd go through again, and you'd export the dialogue, and you'd go through again, you export the music and the effects, and blah blah blah. So you have your stems. All right, so let's check out this real quick. So over on the Roles tab is Roles is QuickTime Movie, which is what we were just discussing. But you can also do roles as separate files. So what that does is you can say, and you'll be able to see this here. So I've got all my dialogue as one WAV file, all my effects as another WAV file, and all my music as another WAV file. But there's also a way to isolate even characters. So I'm going to add an audio file here, and let's see. So I've got a WAV file that's just going to be Tony as mono, a WAV file that's just going to be effects as stereo, music as stereo, and then down here, I want this just to be Katie, who is the other player in the scene. So a mono track of Katie. Now, when I say export this, what it's going to do is it's going to export an H.264 video file and then all these separate audio files. So you got all of your guide tracks for all your characters in one pop. Speaking of pops, you want to put pops across all tracks for this, or all roles, I guess. And the other thing that you can do with this is you can say, all right, well, I want a multi-track QuickTime movie. So you only want to send one container, the QuickTime movie, but you can also have individual audio components built within it. So we'll do all the dialogue as a mono track, and then all the effects and music as stereo, which is pretty cool. And again, you could add to that. So that's a way to make your guide tracks, which is beautiful because if you're on another system, you're doing them one at a time, unless there's some magic thing that I don't know about. Hopefully there is, because it sucks. Now, the AAF that's going to go to Pro Tools or Logic or
Fairlight,
wherever, or Fairlight, Resolve, that requires a third-party plugin. So there's something called Extra Pro, and I'm going to open that up right now.
By the way, if your heart is set on a re-recording mixer at this mix house, the man or woman who's going to mix your final project, and you really want them to know how much you love them, this is the way to do it. You're going to deliver with minimal effort. I mean, you don't have to do anything. Minimal effort, the cleanest audio delivery they've ever gotten. And I'm talking, if you got 50 or 60 tracks, it doesn't matter. This is the cleanest delivery they will ever get for audio tracks, for Pro Tools or whatever, and it's amazing. And it's really easy to do. And they will possibly love you back. I can't guarantee that. And
I'll show you why. So, all right. So I took a couple of, I don't know why that's selected. All right. So this is the Extra Pro Audio Convert. And what it does is it takes a Final Cut XML file, which you would export from your Final Cut. And you could say File and Export XML, calling it whatever you wanted. I've already gone through this. So you export an XML file, and then you bring it into, you bring it into Extra Pro Audio Convert. You set a destination. You can set a few preferences. You can decide which roles you want. Now there's nothing loaded right there, but here's what it looks like. So you could have your effects role. You have your dialogue from the camera, which is camera sound. We probably would turn that off. Dialogue for Tony, Katie, score, source, retime dialogue for those shots that we were messing with the speed on. And then it gives you information here about, retime clip was moved to its own channel. Some unsupported audio effects were removed. And, relatively short list of things that it did because the AAF doesn't carry all the info. And what you end up with, and I've got Logic open here, so let me go over there. So let's talk about this for a second because this gets interesting. Remember, Mike was talking about 5.1 audio, and it all inhabits one little container within the timeline. Okay, so this what you're looking at here in Logic, which essentially looks the same in Pro Tools, comes from this little timeline here. So now I'm just going to minimize all the things in the timeline so we can see what's going on. So this timeline and this timeline are the same timeline. Now, what you've got here is a 5.1 background for the restaurant dining room that's laid out. And let's stretch these so you can see the names. So this is effects A1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then effects 7 and 8 are this little stereo effects that we're hanging around. Here's some dialogue, single stripe from the camera. It's mono. And then you've got dialogue. dialogue. These were the original names that were on there. I changed a few of them just to demonstrate Katie and Tony. So everything's marked and broken out. So you've got 5 characters in a scene, and you've taken the time and trouble to do your roles correctly. All of your characters are going to be broken out onto their own tracks, which is nice for your mixer.
You're not doing any of this, man.
Right. And down here for music, the track's labeled music, but it's also labeled score because this is score. This down here, that's source. And so it's taken all of these elements and spreading them out for you and saving your sound department the time of doing it, unless they really like to do that sort of thing.
They don't. They really don't.
Right. And so down here is in these bottom 3 tracks, it says retime dialogue channels 1, 2, and 3. So this is what it looks like when the AAF comes into Pro Tools or Logic or Resolve from Final Cut. Everything's kind of organized. Everything's broken out. It supports all the different formats. And what can I say? This has got to be an advantage to some people. So I'm just going to hide that.
And let's one thing to consider, Final Cut, they kind of intentionally did not put in every bell and whistle. For example, it does not automatically export EDLs. Not because, well, because EDLs are outdated. So why are we going to put that in as an outdated system? If you really want to do it, there's a third-party software. They want to work in XMLs, but we have to, most of the mixing we're doing these days, for better or worse, is in Pro Tools. There's some great mixers using it. So you have to use third-party software for some of this, like X Pro. But it's designed to work well and integrate well with third-party software. And there's some amazing apps out there that fill in the few gaps there are and do a great job with it.
XML is also used to go to Resolve. Resolve accepts Final Cut 10 XML for color. I think something, as with all systems, when you translate from one to another, there's some things you should prepare for. You can send to Resolve via XML, but you have to do what, Mike?
You have to separate, you have to detach the audio. You have to detach the audio. And if you don't, it will still get to Resolve. And I don't know Resolve well, but most colorists I work with use it. If you don't detach the audio and it goes to Resolve, the Resolve clips are kind of embedded in an additional container, and the colorist can't match back directly to them. They have to go into the nested clip. So extra steps. If you detach the audio, so you're going to dupe your sequence, you're going to detach the audio in the dupe. You're going to go through and make sure all your auditions are finalized. If you have any auditions left in your cut, you're going to just make it as, I don't think you have to get rid of compound clips. I don't believe, but I can't remember. But you want to definitely get rid of the audio, send that over to your colorist, and I've had great success with that. So one step you have to do.
The kind of thing that you would do if you were preparing an EDL for Avid.
Yeah.
When you're taking off all the effects and you're going through and simplifying. I think this is a pretty common process.
Yeah, your colorist doesn't want the titles. They just want the clips for color. Give them that, and it avoids any translation issues. Right.
Let's talk about if you're delivering some visual effects.
Ooh,
general philosophy on that. Mike, I know you've used roles extensively for your visual effects. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I don't know if that's normal, but it's what I came up with. And
magical system. Well, let's talk before we talk about like those specifics. Mm-hmm. Final Cut can work with original media for a lot of things, not raw footage, but it can work with ProRes Quad 4. It can work with Red Raw. It can work with some pretty high quality stuff, and it can deal with image sequences as well. So we talked about switching back and forth to original media, and that is under this menu, where we're looking at the view menu up on the viewer, switching from proxy to original. So you would switch back to original, select the stuff you want to export. As we talked about here, making a visual effects compound clip and calling it something and numbering your sequence. You can then search for, let's say we had, that's visual effects number 1, and that's VFX number 2.
We could go part, by the way.
What?
I didn't do that in the project I used it for.
Okay, and then I'm just going to search.
It would have been smart.
Well, we'll talk about that in a second, because now I can just search for visual effects, and then I can just select all those and export them as bits or copy them to their own thing. But because they're compound clips, if I get a version 1, version 2, version 3, and I add them to this compound clip, again, all my sequences are going to update with all the visual effects that are in there. And I can look at comparison and go back and forth. So, but exporting elements for visual effects or anything else goes through the share menu. So you can export a master file, which is all the high-end ProRes codecs and a bunch of other stuff, but you can also export image sequence. So let's just drag one of those over here. So you can do TIFF, PNG, Photoshop, AXR, JPEG, DPX. Color space is automatic, and it's not changeable. Apple products in general tend to give full range color. So if someone is working in like a 709 environment or something, the colors might look a little different coming out, but I think if you're aware of the full range of it all, you can execute stuff correctly. It took us a little bit of figuring out to get there on Focus, the Warner Brothers movie where we used Final Cut, but it does work. So you prepare your media for exports. If we're talking about temp effects, you can export ProRes. If you're talking about final effects, you can export the original media. So there's a lot of different ways to get in and out of the system. X to Pro sends to Pro Tools. EDL-X makes an EDL. There are ways to add and use custom LUTs. So if your DP is building custom LUTs, those can be imported into Final Cut. And the getting back to the guide tracks, it's the huge time-saving feature, which the time that you can save with the way some of this works, where like you can do the guide tracks all in one pop. You can export an XML to get your AAF done, so you don't have to stop working to do it. Avid has to shut down to be occupied to do that, and sometimes it can be rather time-consuming. And the same thing for video exports. Final Cut allows you to export and work at the same time. So these are all little things that add up as far as time is concerned. And if you're busting for a screening and you have, okay, we've got a screening, that means we have to finish reels, we have to make our GCP, we have to do our temp mix, blah, blah, blah. You can add that time back and work longer because it doesn't take you so long to output.
Well, I just had...
Don't wait too long, though.
Don't do that. No, I just did a project where I had to output 10 sequences, one after the other.
Yeah.
Load up the first one, tell it to share, tell it to export. While it was prepping, I'd load up the next, tell it to share. I had a queue of 6 or 7. I walked away and I had lunch. And I came back and we were all done. It's great.
Lunch is a good thing. Lunch is a good thing.
Well, aside from lunch, the fact that I could queue up multiples and leave or keep, and I could queue them up while the others were exporting was really nice. Also
a good thing. And, it's so XML centric. Like if you need, for any cutting room, they're going to need a code book. So there's another tool called Producer's Best Friend, made by Intelligent Assistants, who makes also sync and link, change list program for Premiere and for Final Cut. I think it's based on Final Cut on Cinema Tools. But there's ways to get extremely detailed spreadsheets with all sorts of information and all sorts of configurations with this. And it's an add-on tool, but well worth the extra money. So, anything that you can get out of Final Cut in a spreadsheet means you can have a CSV or a tab delimited or whatever and import that into FileMaker if that's your code book.
By the way, delivering a feature film to the colorist, to the audio department, to everyone, I use that software. I gave them a spreadsheet with every piece of information they could want, broken into different tabs. They wanted speed changes or color changes or resizes or visual. It was all done, and it took, I think, a minute and a half of my work, and the software took 30 seconds to work its magic. Versus doing it
almost
by
2
hand
minutes.
on Avid. Almost. Yeah. On Avid, that would have taken me 2 days. Full 2 days of doing that.
Right. Well, I think, it's Final Cut is pretty versatile and allows you to come up with a lot of your own schemes. I think that's actually, it's kind of it's a blessing and a curse where you want to be able to come up with your own schemes, but there's a lack of standardization in the industry because of it. And so everybody doesn't know what they need to know in order to form teams and form bulletproof cutting rooms. Or if somebody has to leave, you're not stuck with something. Avid's pretty good at that. Let's get on to screening prep. And screening prep we'll just talk the philosophy of screening prep. So presuming you're working on a movie, you're probably working LCR, maybe 5.1 or 5.0 possibly.
What is LCR? Center, right. I don't know that.
It's just a 3-channel.
Okay,
so,
there you are.
Final Cut can work with that. So there's a few boxes, like there's a USB audio box called the Quartet, made by Apogee, that we've used before. And basically it takes USB out of the computer, and it understands that you can set it to stereo or 5.1 or mono or whatever, and then it distributes the signal out to the appropriate speakers. And if you're editing that way, you want to screen that way, you want to project that way. So I'm just going to take our edit here. So I've got my fabulous rough cut open, and I'm going to click on the icon for the sequence project itself and open up the inspector. It's already open, thankfully. Now there's a little modify button over here, and you can see all the specs of the project here, but I'm just going to click modify, and we get this little drop down, and that contains start time code, video formats, rendering files, all that. Some people are in the good habit. The way I like to do it, if I'm building a show and it's reels, it's 5 reels. Reel 1 will be hour 1, reel 2, hour 2, and so on. This is the place where you would set that. And if you want the highest possible rendering quality, go up to the ProRes XQ if that's what you're outputting. But down here in the audio area of this, we can go audio surround, and we'll just stay at 48K. You could go all the way up to 192K if you're working super high quality audio. And now, remember, let's see, reload that. Okay, so we're now in a surround project cut sequence. And so you'll notice over here, I'm going to close my inspector so we get a little more room. Yeah.
I like that bright light from the windows, like aliens. It's like a fade. Half your face has disappeared to the.
Okay.
Go into the light.
Nice.
And, it's straight out of Poltergeist.
If you look over here on the right edge of the timeline, those meters are now 5 meters wide and 6 meters wide. Excuse me. And if we play through the sequence, you'll probably notice them all going, because remember the restaurant dining room that we looked at in the that we looked at in the Logic Pro AAF import. The background was 5.1, and so that's coming up here. All the dialogue, everything that's slated dialogue, is going to be center channel unless you pan it otherwise. And so this is a good way to set up for 5.1, and even if you're doing LCR, you still set up this way, and you'll only be using the LCR meters there. And so you make your reel, you set the audio format, you hopefully mix your show in a room that is tolerant of that audio format, so you get a good idea of what it sounds like. And what I am in the habit of doing on a bigger show is have your sequence, do your mix, do an output, and then round trip all those reels back to Final Cut to tie them together. This is something you would normally do. That way you can just check your joins, your transitions between reels, be sure everything's okay. Recommend using leaders, so cut off your leaders. You can either bring them back into Final Cut, output one master thing from there, or oftentimes nowadays you send it out to get a DCP made, or perhaps you make one in-house. DCP making is pretty time consuming. And so unless you've got a separate workstation for that, I recommend going somewhere who's got some of the really big computers to power through it. And the other thing about screenings are always this marker, this point in time, this important event that you're working towards, and then you get notes, and then you're working toward the next screening. So it's important to keep track of those things. And earlier we moved a cut from one library to another. I think it's good practice to, when you have a screening, keep a library for that screening entirely. So it's just that. And in the library, we're going to look at something else here that we haven't really talked about.
Yeah, overblown, like you mentioned earlier, if they get bloated, they can take a long time to open. So I got in the habit, when I'm working, especially on a feature which is so much longer than a half-hour show, which has more information in it, get your old cuts, make a library just for your old cuts. Make 2 libraries if you have to, just to get them out of there. You have them as backup. You have them if you need them.
Yeah.
But it keeps.
Well, everyone's done that on an Avid,
quicker.
the famous assistance library, and that's where the graveyard is for all that stuff. But also something you can do just to freeze that moment in time for reference is make a library and go back, go open the inspector with the library, and you'll be able to see all your settings here. But the idea would be you take your locked reels, put them in a library, standalone library, and then consolidate that library. So what that'll do is it'll take all the media from that particular cut and bring it in to one place. It's not going to remove it from the other, but the storage is relatively cheap nowadays. And so I think it's a good idea to consolidate the media, bring it into a library, if not for the whole show, for each reel individually, but just so you can have all that intact somewhere. It's just an extra step of protection, security, whatever you want to call it, just in case something goes crazy. Because there's always that time when you have screening 1 and screening 2 and screening 3, and somebody says, in the friends and family, we had something in reel 2 that was really good. Can you go find it? And it's much easier to say yes to that when you have packaged everything up nice and neat. And anyway, that's just my personal preference on how to do this sort of thing. Yeah, and it's different with television. But in any case, when you're done with something, pack it up. Anyone who's done this, prepared for screening, is going to have all their tips and tricks and everything they do and how they handle their media and their mixes and their archival systems. But that's just a little touching on it in respect to Final Cut.
This is another bit of a tip following up on this. One thing Avid is really good at is you can take a sequence or a project and open it with multiple versions of Avid.
Right.
Final Cut doesn't work that way. So anything old, when you open it in a new version of Final Cut, the library will be automatically updated to the new version. It does not go backwards. So be prepared for that. If you're on a newer version of Final Cut and you have this archived SSD, it's going to likely be upgraded to the newer version, and it won't open on the older one anymore. A little tip you can also do is when you're going to upgrade your Final Cut to the new version, take your application before you upgrade, zip it, store it somewhere. So I have 3 or 4 back versions of Final Cut just in case I have to get them. The upgrades don't cost you anything once you bought the software, so it doesn't matter. Keep backups of your old version, zip somewhere just in case you need them.
Good tip. And so, Mike, you're welcome.
I learned it from you.
Good tip from me then. Cool. Well, Mike, I think we've covered our bases for today on this one, and thanks again. We will probably be back, maybe with some more stuff to be determined.
If you got questions, comments, you know where to put them. We'll try to get to them. We're just trying to share the love. We're just trying to share the love here.
Well, thanks again, Mike, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, man.